This was supposed to be Prince Harry's victory lap. The moment he finally proved the press was the villain. The moment his long, bruising war against the tabloids ended with a righteous roar. Instead, the courtroom detonated a bomb so loud it shook the entire narrative, and Harry is standing right in the blast zone. Because what exploded this week wasn't just another legal argument. It wasn't a technicality. It wasn't some dusty procedural footnote. It was something far more dangerous. It was a question Harry never wanted asked. How was this case really built? And once that question landed, everything started to unravel.
It's way, in my view, to monetize them by reminding the world that they are royal. He got that title.
What was supposed to be Prince Harry's righteous march toward justice has suddenly started to look a lot more like a slow motion implosion. That opening alone set the tone. Because suddenly, this wasn't a story about newspapers behaving badly 20 years ago. This was a story about now, about pressure, about tactics, about what happens behind the scenes when a carefully polished crusade starts cracking under scrutiny. For years, Harry has sold this lawsuit as a moral mission. A wounded prince versus a rotten industry. A traumatized son taking on the monsters he says destroyed his mother and poisoned his life. That framing has been repeated so often it hardened into fact for his supporters. Questioning it was treated like heresy. But courtrooms don't care about branding. They care about documents, emails, testimony. And buried in those papers is a story that feels nothing like the one Harry has been telling. Because what's emerging isn't clean. It isn't noble. And it certainly isn't simple. Behind the public speeches and carefully chosen words, there are allegations of pressure being applied, of witnesses being leaned on, of researchers allegedly pushing people harder and harder to say what was needed. Language that sounds less like truth-seeking and more like compliance management. Say it. Shape it, or else. And if even a fraction of this is accurate, the entire case changes shape. This stops being about justice and starts looking dangerously like control. Here's the part that makes insiders uneasy. Harry didn't walk into this fight alone. He didn't arrive armed only with principle and personal pain. No, he arrived flanked by some of the most notorious figures in tabloid history. Men whose careers were built on hacking phones, invading privacy, and crossing legal lines without blinking. Convicted hackers, disgraced operatives, figures who once embodied everything Harry claims to despise. And yet here they are, rebranded, repositioned, standing beside him as allies. That alone should have set off alarms. But now, with emails referencing threats, payments, and bullying tactics, it's not just awkward, it's explosive. Because suddenly the moral high ground looks less like solid rock and more like a trapdoor. Sources say Harry is incandescent, not mildly annoyed, but not quietly frustrated, furious, blindsided, lashing out behind closed doors as the story he spent years curating starts slipping through his fingers. Because once the spotlight stops shining only on the Daily Mail and starts illuminating the machinery behind this case, everything wobbles. This is no longer David versus Goliath. This is David showing up with Goliath's old mercenaries and insisting he's still the hero. And the hypocrisy is brutal. Harry has spent years lecturing the world about ethics, about trauma, about accountability, about how words can be violence and power must be handled responsibly. He has positioned himself as the moral conscience of public life. But now we're reading about alleged threats to reluctant witnesses, about pressure to raise their game, about money being quietly suggested when cooperation didn't come easily. That isn't reform. That's coercion. And it obliterates the image Harry has been selling. The irony cuts deeper with every page. The man who claims to protect ordinary people from media abuse now appears linked, directly or indirectly, to tactics that look disturbingly similar to bullying. The man who says he hates tabloid culture is allegedly relying on its worst veterans to win his case. The man who demands transparency now finds himself tangled in secrecy and shadowy arrangements. This is the moment Harry snaps. Because for him, this lawsuit was never just legal, it was symbolic. It was supposed to validate everything he says had since walking away from royal life. It was meant to prove he was right, that the press is evil, that he is the victim, that his crusade is justified. Instead, it's exposing a pattern, one where the ends always justify the means. And this pattern doesn't exist in isolation. It mirrors everything we've seen from Harry over the past few years. The lawsuits launched not just to win, but to punish. The interviews designed not to explain, but to wound. The constant reframing of events so he and Meghan are always the persecuted saints, and anyone who disagrees is cast as cruel or corrupt. Now, that strategy has collided with something he can't control, a courtroom that doesn't care about feelings. Judges don't weigh trauma the way PR teams do. They weigh evidence, and the evidence being discussed is deeply uncomfortable. The court has heard references to researchers acting aggressively, to witnesses being bollocked, to threats that didn't work, praise that didn't work, and finally money being floated as the solution. That is not the language of justice. It's the language of manipulation. And suddenly, the question everyone is whispering becomes impossible to ignore. If Harry's case is so strong, why did it need to be built like this? Why lean on convicted criminals? Why pressure witnesses? Why blur ethical lines so recklessly? The answer may be painfully simple, because without this scaffolding, the case collapses. And Harry knows it. That's why this moment is so dangerous for him, because once scrutiny turns inward, once the public starts examining how this case was constructed instead of why, the entire narrative flips. Harry stops being the brave whistleblower and starts looking like an entitled prince throwing millions at a vendetta, furious that the world won't bend to his version of reality. And the risk here isn't just losing in court. It's losing credibility, the one thing Harry can't afford to bleed out completely. Because if people conclude that he's willing to collaborate with unethical actors, pressure witnesses, and weaponize the justice system to settle personal scores, then his moral lectures become meaningless. His speeches about compassion ring hollow, his warnings about abuse of power turn into bitter jokes. This was meant to be Harry's triumph. Instead, it's becoming the moment the House of Cards starts to shake. And here's where the damage accelerates. Because once credibility starts leaking, it doesn't drip. It hemorrhages. What's unfolding in that courtroom isn't just a legal dispute anymore. It's a character autopsy. Every email referenced, every phrase pulled into the light, every uncomfortable implication chips away at the persona Harry has been clinging to for years. The wounded reformer, the ethical warrior, the man who had to do this because no one else would. But now, people aren't asking whether the press behaved badly decades ago. They're asking whether Harry is behaving badly right now. Behind palace walls, the reaction isn't outrage. It isn't even shock. It's resignation. A quiet, grim acknowledgement from those who've watched this pattern repeat itself over and over again. A grievance is identified. Lawyers are hired. Advisors urging caution are brushed aside. Anyone who questions optics, strategy, or unintended consequences is labeled unsupportive, or worse, disloyal. What's different this time is the direction of the spotlight. It's not fixed on journalists anymore. It's fixed on Harry's methods. Because once a court starts questioning how witnesses were approached, how statements were shaped, and how much money was floating around behind the scenes, the entire moral framework collapses. This stops being about whether newspapers crossed lines 20 years ago and starts being about whether Harry crossed them now. And that is not a comparison he wins. The language revealed in filings is especially corrosive, not because it proves wrongdoing outright, but because it exposes mindset, intent, a willingness to escalate pressure when cooperation isn't forthcoming, to treat witnesses not as independent truth tellers, but as obstacles to be managed, nudged, pushed, sweetened, broken down. That mentality should feel familiar because it mirrors something else we've all watched unfold. The way Harry talks about the media, about his family, about critics. There is always a villain, always an enemy, always a justification for going further, harder, louder. In Harry's world, opposition doesn't exist in good faith. It exists to be crushed. And that's exactly why this case is spiraling. Courts are allergic to crusades. Judges don't reward emotional storytelling or inherited trauma. They reward precision, restraint, and clean hands. The moment a claimant looks like they're orchestrating outcomes instead of uncovering truth, sympathy evaporates. And sympathy is the one currency Harry has been been trading on for years. What makes this especially self-destructive is how unnecessary it all was. Harry didn't have to lead this charge. He didn't have to be the face of it. He didn't have to surround himself with figures whose pasts are so toxic that their involvement poisons everything they touch. But Harry has never been able to resist a fight that feels personal. This lawsuit isn't just about the Daily Mail. It's about control. About reasserting power over an institution he believes humiliated him. About proving loudly and publicly that he is not weak, not silenced, not irrelevant. And that desperation is showing. People are asking questions they never asked before. Why does Harry always end up in court? Why do his legal battles lean so heavily on narrative instead of hard evidence? Why do so many of his allies turn out to be ethically radioactive? And why does accountability only ever flow outward, never inward? These are not questions that can be neutralized with another interview or carefully sourced statement. Because the more Harry insists he alone is fighting corruption, the more his own behavior is measured against the standards he claims to uphold. And by those standards, this case looks increasingly indefensible. What's happening now isn't a single dramatic collapse. It's erosion. A slow, steady draining away of trust. Every revelation replaces the image of Harry as principled reformer with something far less flattering, a man consumed by grievance, willing to burn credibility, alliances, and institutions to satisfy it. While celebrity fortunes continue to rise and fall, the public response to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle has followed a strikingly steady course. That steadiness is the problem, because the audience has stopped swinging emotionally. They're watching coldly now, measuring patterns, connecting dots, and there's another layer Harry may not have fully accounted for. This case doesn't exist in isolation. It sits alongside everything else: the interviews, the book, the documentaries, the endless accusations against his family. When motives are assessed, they aren't evaluated in a vacuum. A pattern emerges. A man who repeatedly frames himself as a victim while wielding extraordinary wealth, status, and power. And when someone that privileged claims persecution, courts look very carefully at how that power is being used. So when suggestions surface that witnesses were pressured or threatened, even indirectly, the narrative flips violently. Harry is no longer exposing abuse of power, he's being accused of enabling it. That's why this moment is so volatile. It explains why Harry is reportedly furious, brittle, and increasingly isolated. Why former supporters are suddenly quiet, why even sympathetic commentators are hedging their language. They can feel the shift. The case that was supposed to define Harry as a reformer may end up defining him as something else entirely. A cautionary tale. Because this is what happens when personal vendettas are dressed up as moral crusades. When trauma is weaponized instead of processed. When winning becomes more important than being fair. The tragedy, if there is one, is that Harry genuinely believes he's right. He believes his pain entitles him to rewrite the rules. He believes his cause excuses excess. And he believes that because the press has done wrong before, it must always be wrong now. But belief isn't proof, and righteousness isn't a legal strategy. As this case drags on, the real danger for Harry isn't just losing, it's exposure. Exposure as someone who lectures about accountability but can't tolerate it himself. Someone who condemns bullying while benefiting from it. Someone who claims to despise tabloid tactics while quietly adopting their ugliest methods. If the court ultimately rules against him, it will sting. But if the court and the public decide his methods mirror the very behavior he condemns, the damage will be permanent. Because once the mask slips, it doesn't go back on. Harry wanted a reckoning with the media. What he may be getting instead is a reckoning with himself, is a reckoning with